You have a number of documents in your advanced materials that describe the work we have done. This includes work that our enhanced cleanup program, our improved data access efforts, and our development and use of special GIS-based tools, as well as CalEnviroscreen have supported. Again, I want to underscore for you that I will continue and complete the systematic improvements that are already underway. I have already begun seeking input from our external stakeholders and meeting with staff internally to identify additional improvements beyond what we have already committed to that we need to make. I will prioritize these improvements. I will establish work plans. I will identify the resources, and then I will implement them. You also have my unwavering commitment, and this is my personal commitment to excellence in environmental and public health protection and public service. This is a hallmark of my career, and it is what I demand from the people who work for me. Last year, you recognized the importance of our effort and you provided funding for reforms. I'd like to discuss now with you how those 2014-15 budget augmentations have allowed us to make progress in 3 key areas: our hazardous waste tracking system, which the President Pro Tem referred to, our cost recovery system, and our permitting system. I would then like to give you an update on what we're doing in the area of enforcement, because we know that is also of concern. And then I would like to close with a discussion of Exide. Our hazardous waste tracking system includes the correction of manifest errors. As I said earlier, the department receives approximately 450,000 paper manifests each year. We receive the 5th carbon copy in this stack of forms. It is not always legible, and our job is to make sure that that 5th carbon copy matches the first one that went with the waste. There are over 900 registered transporters and roughly 2 million tons of waste being tracked in this system. We now have staff that examine those waste manifests every day. They're looking for the errors to detect illegal shipments to unauthorized facilities. And I'm happy to say that since we've started doing this daily, we have not found any illegal shipments. We have found some instances of transporters who were not registered, against whom we have pursued vigorous enforcement action. So far, we've corrected nearly 7,500 manifests. We expect this number to increase now that we have the staff on board to expand the effort. I want to underscore that as part of this process, we are looking at the hazardous waste tracking system overall. We are hampered somewhat in our ability to make changes to that system because that system and the form it uses is specifically dictated by the federal government. We know that they have an effort underway to improve the system, but we don't yet have any idea when they're likely to complete that effort, although we expect it several years out. So what we're trying to do is strategically use resources to make some key changes to what we can change to improve the performance of the system while we wait for the new federal system to come online. And we will keep you updated as that effort goes forward. I'd like to move now to cost recovery and direct your attention to the TAN packet that you received today. The information on the right-hand side of that packet is for this part of the hearing, and the handouts on the left-hand side will be used during the budget discussions. As you can see on page 1 in the chart in that packet, Since 1987, we have spent approximately $1.9 billion cleaning up contaminated sites in California. The department accounted for approximately 90% of those costs. Unfortunately, we did identify that about 10% of those costs, or roughly $194 million, since the beginning of the cleanup effort, were not accounted for. In the current budget, we received 14 limited-term positions and $1.6 million to evaluate and take action to reduce those unaccounted for costs and to improve our cost recovery procedures overall going forward. In addition, last August, the state auditor released a report identifying 11 additional action items recommended for improvements in the department's cost recovery program. The department submitted mandatory progress reports on implementing those recommendations last October and then just in February. At this time, 6 of the 11 recommendations are fully implemented. 2 of the 11 require action by the legislature, and bills have been introduced by the Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee. That leaves 3 recommendations, which are currently in process and are partially complete. More detail about the recommendations and their implementation status can be found on pages 26 through 29. It's in tabular form, and it's in the advanced materials we provided to you yesterday. But going back to that tan packet, and I apologize for the switching back and forth, of the $194 million in unresolved costs that we had identified, $52.2 million are now resolved. That includes nearly $6 million in direct collections, $29 million for which there are no responsible parties and they have been assigned to our orphan fund program, and the remainder we have largely resolved through correcting data errors. $69 million in costs are associated with sites that have been referred to the Attorney General or other prosecutors for litigation. They are in bankruptcy or in other legal action. That leaves us with $71 million still unresolved, but we are on track for resolution of those costs in the coming fiscal year. You said you wanted to get into the weeds, so I will tell you now that we have developed 27 specific and detailed cost recovery procedures to ensure consistent and rigorous pursuit of reimbursements. We have trained approximately 400 staff in the use of these procedures, and if you weren't counting, that's almost half of the people working for the department. In addition, more than 200 have received targeted intensive training in cost recovery. We've also created a centralized and integrated electronic tracking tool. It has a visual display of performance metrics, and it monitors workflow, identifies bottlenecks, and measures our progress. We can look at it quickly and see where we are on all of these efforts at any time. We also worked with the legislature to provide information on cost recovery legislation, consistent with the recommendations in the audit. The legislation includes adjusting the statute of limitations, authorizing enhanced information gathering from certain responsible parties, and also authorizing the write-off of small debts less than $5,000 where the cost of recovering that debt would exceed the amount we would likely collect. In the coming budget year, we will resolve the remaining $71 million in costs that were unaccounted for. We will also fully integrate cost recovery procedures into our core program work. I'm going to turn now to a discussion of our permitting program. In late 2012, the department commissioned an independent evaluation of its permitting program. The evaluation identified systemic problems that led to delays, including a lack of clear and consistent processes and criteria for making decisions, a lack of effective management structure and performance metrics, and poor staff training. We now have in place a clear management structure, and we're prepared to adjust that if needed as we move forward. The department also developed a work plan with clear deliverables and milestones to enhance its permitting process. The current budget includes $699,000 and 2 limited-term positions to implement that work plan. Some of the enhancements that we have made include the development of a complete and detailed process flow diagram for all of the steps and decisions involved in permit review. A small visual of that flow diagram is in your materials. We've also trained staff to apply cutting-edge business and engineering methods, including using a collaborative team approach to improve performance by systematically analyzing and reducing process time. These are techniques that are used by some of the leading companies in the industrial manufacturing world, companies like Toyota, and we received a grant from the governor's office last year to get this training, and we are applying these tools. We have set 2 years as the target time frame for total permit review. We have identified technical review as the part of the process where the critical bottleneck occurs, and we have set a target time period for that review at 13 months. We then applied the same analytical tools I was just discussing to that part of the process and developed a target to increase the percent of our technical review that is done from 20% to 80% within the target time period. For more information on that permit review process, including a shot of that flow diagram, you can look at pages 34 to 37 in the advanced material that we provided yesterday. We've also initiated the development of key criteria, procedures, and guidance to achieve the technical review goals. We developed and launched a reporting system to publicly track progress on our permitting decisions and transparency. You can see information on this on pages 3 and 4 of your TAN packet. As predicted during the consideration of this effort last year, during our analysis, we identified gaps in critical support functions in other parts of our department, in other offices and programs that support the permitting process. In the budget proposal before you, we have proposed mechanisms to address those gaps, and I'll go into that in more detail during the budget portion of the hearing. We've been asked about the permitting backlog. We're going to go a little deeper into the weeds now. Hazardous waste permits are issued for a defined term of up to 10 years. Federal and state law allows facilities that have permits that are nearing the end of their life to continue to operate after the permit has expired if the facility submits to the department an application for renewal at least 6 months before the permit expires. We refer to those permits as continued permits because they are continuing to operate the facility on the expired permit under the application shield allowed in law. But as I just was discussing with you, we have developed a target for our optimized permit review at 2 years, and the applications are due only 6 months before the permit expires. That means that the department will need 18 months after the permit expires to complete the permit review, and during that time, there will be a continued permit. The number of continued permits at any given time should fluctuate depending on the cycle of permits reaching the end of their permit life. The large chart that is behind us here and is on page 5 of your tan packet shows you what this cycle looks like. If the department processes permit renewals in a timely manner, the number of continued permits will track the number of permits that are expiring. But if the renewals are not processed in a timely manner, the number of continued permits will grow relative to the number of permits that are expiring. The relative growth in the number of continued permits is what represents our backlog. In the current budget year, the department received roughly $1.2 million and 8 limited-term positions to reduce that backlog. The department committed to reduce the backlog by processing 8 continued permits in the current fiscal year. Additional information about this can be found on pages 31 through 33 in the advanced materials we provided to you. In the first half of this fiscal year, the department processed 4 permits. 2 of those were continued, but 2 were new permits. We are, however, on track to process 7 more continued permits by the end of this fiscal year. That will be 1 more than we committed to. However, in the coming fiscal year, we still expect that the number of continued permits is going to increase because there are a large number of permits that will be expiring. We expect that the enhancements we have underway to our permitting process will allow those permits to be processed in a timely way so that the number of continued permits doesn't grow relative to the number of expiring permits. That is, although the number of continued permits will go up, the backlog will not go up. The backlog will go down. So we expect that over time you will see that the number of continued permits does indeed track the number of expiring permits in a very predictable and cyclical way. But what does this mean in practice? The content of these boxes and some other materials we have with us today represent the application for 1 permit. It includes a description of the facility's equipment and devices, design drawings, tank assessment reports, and facility inspection logs, among many other things.
So that's that plus the one in the back? And for what size site?
This right here is volume 2 of 5 volumes of Appendix A of the permit application for the Exide Technologies permit. I would also like to point out that this is the 7th revision to that permit. All of this information has to be read, evaluated, confirmed, compared to performance standards and other requirements, and ultimately turned into a controlling permit with enforceable provisions for performance, testing, monitoring, record-keeping, and reporting. The process also includes opportunities for public review and comment, and the time we need to review their comments, take their input, and make appropriate changes. It's also, as I said, important to note that this is the 7th revision, so we've been through this more than once. Completing all of this work in a 2-year period is a very significant undertaking. Going forward, we've requested $1.6 million and 16 limited-term positions in the coming budget year across 6 divisions and offices in the department to address gaps in the critical support areas for our permitting process that we identified during the analysis we did in this current year. We will finalize criteria in the coming year. We will adopt procedures and guidance and define roles and responsibilities between the program units in order to minimize the process delays and cut review times consistent with the analysis we've done. We are on track to meet our commitment to process the 8 continued permits in the current year and 9 continued permits in the coming year, and we may even beat that. So now, just a little bit of an update on our enforcement program efforts. We understand that enforcement is a critical part of our effort to regulate hazardous waste and ensure companies are acting in compliance with California's high standards. In the advanced materials we provided to you yesterday, there's a summary of our enforcement work that can be found beginning on page 20. From 2012 to 2014, work by our Enforcement Division and Office of Criminal Investigation resulted in nearly $14.8 million in administrative settlements, civil and criminal judgments, and restitution. 77 cases were referred to district attorneys, city attorneys, or the Attorney General's office. We also received 39 felony pleas, 12 misdemeanor pleas, 16 years of criminal probation, 500 hours of community service, and 5 arrests. And it's not enough. We are also working on a proposal to define process criteria that we will be using going forward in a very public way to consider compliance history as part of our permitting process. We've heard from everyone that there is a perceived lack of performance in this area, and we are addressing it. We expect to have that proposal out for initial concept discussion in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and we hope to finalize it several months thereafter. Ultimately, we will bring it forward in the form of a regulation so everybody understands how we will consider compliance history and permitting, and also how we will use it to determine if the revocation of an existing permit is warranted. In addition, we have a draft policy currently out for public comment on supplemental environmental projects that will benefit affected communities by directing penalties and settlements from the enforcement of violations of our laws and regulations. Some of that will be directed into the community for beneficial projects under this policy. We've also begun a pilot project to receive public comment on draft settlement agreements because of concerns we heard about settlement agreements being entered into without appropriate input from those who are affected. We're also doing targeted enforcement initiatives in impacted communities, and we're doing a comprehensive review of our enforcement program that we expect will result in the same sort of work plan that we did for our permitting program, and we will come to you when we have identified the concrete measures we need to undertake in addition to what we already are doing to ensure that not only is the rest of the program that we are responsible for overseeing being done properly, but our enforcement end is following suit as well. The last thing I wanted to talk with you about is Exide. I know there's a lot of interest here in the Joint Committee and also others who are in the audience today. As you know, the Exide technology-led battery recycling plant in Vernon has had an application pending with the department for far too long. Exide Technologies has been one of my very highest priorities since I took office, and one that I have personally spent a very great deal of time on. As you are aware, announcements were made today that the Exide Technologies plant is closing. Based on my review of their permit application, their compliance history, and the impacts they were having on the community, I concluded they could not be allowed to operate because they could not operate in compliance and could not operate safely. And therefore, we would not issue them a permit, and I communicated that to them on February 26th. As a result of that communication, we entered into a revised stipulation and order. We did that because we understood that Exide Technologies was in bankruptcy, and we wanted to make sure that we secured, going forward, the costs that would be needed and the commitment that the work would be done to properly close the facility, to clean up the site, and to clean up the contamination in the affected communities. The result of that negotiation is a revised stipulation and order that we have signed and Exide has signed. It is in place, and it will ensure this gets done. While we were in negotiations with Exide, they were also working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to resolve the criminal case against that company. That case was resolved by Exide and the U.S. Attorney's Office entering into a non-prosecution agreement that ensures the closure of the facility, accelerates payment of the funds we have in our order required for the cleanup of the residential community, and also it holds Exide on the hook under threat of federal prosecution for complying with our order. This could not have been achieved without the dedicated work, not only of the U.S. Attorney's Office and our office, but also the efforts put in by others as well, including the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the County of Los Angeles. And it is my policy and my plan going forward to continue this kind of coordinated and effective joint effort to ensure that we address the problems that are affecting communities and that we do it responsibly, transparently, and effectively. I have a number of other things I can update you about regarding Exide, including what's being done under the stipulation and order to address the contamination in the industrial area, their on-site waste storage issues, the recent violations we issued to them in January, as well as the progress on cleanup in the residential areas. But I know we have a limited amount of time, and I know you probably have some questions for me. If you would like me to keep talking, I will gladly do that, but I'm also perfectly happy to have you begin with your questions of me.
All right, thank you, Director Lee. First, I'd like to say that we recognize that you've only been on the job for 3 months, and I personally appreciate the length of the presentation. And I know that's not what we asked you to do. We asked you to do a short intro, and then we would jump into it. But I think, you know, I do appreciate the depth, and we're going to go into many of the areas that you've already touched on. I just have one suggestion for the future. It would be very helpful to have had this document, which you should, you know, the first concrete thing you can do is to tell your staff that before an oversight hearing, it would be helpful to have this in our hands more than, I think it was 12 hours, about that. And most of those, I was asleep. So I would really encourage you to do that. We will ask about the specifics in the Exide agreement, but let's start first with the general areas of legislative oversight that you've gone over. And I'm going to focus on the cost recovery issues and whether or not you certainly highlighted, and this committee has, the issue of backlogs and the issue of cost recovery. In fact, this committee, as you said, and this legislature approved a 2-year plan, which involved millions of dollars for limited-term positions to get rid of that backlog. But what I want to get at is whether the underlying problems that created that backlog, which are management problems, have been dealt with, have been identified and dealt with, because these limited positions are going away. So unless we understand why it occurred in the first place and remediate those management problems, we're not going to be able to move, we're not going to change the situation. We'll be back where we were. That's my first question.
And I appreciate the question, Chairwoman. The answer in one word is yes. We are identifying and addressing the systemic issues that resulted in the unrecovered costs. I think I mentioned that we have developed detailed and specific procedures and guidance to staff and have trained them in the use of those procedures and the guidance. We are holding them accountable. They understand that recovering those costs is a critical part of the work of cleaning up the site. It is not something that gets done as an afterthought. It is now embedded in the process of cleaning up a site. The content, there are 27 of those detailed procedures. If you want to go into the specifics of what some of them are, I do have staff here who can give detailed answers about what the procedures are and how they have changed the work that we're doing. We can also, if you are interested, provide a separate briefing where we go through in detail our cost recovery process.
I think the most important thing is the outcome. So we hear from you, your commitment, your recognition of the issue, and I think we have budget, as we will get to the budget issue shortly, that money's going away for the limited term positions. So we're really going to see whether there's been a change. So we're going to continue watching that and encourage you in your efforts. Let's talk about cost recovery, which presents some interesting problems. There are statutes of limitations on some of these projects, which I believe go back, some of them 26 years, which have not been, somehow we have not managed to close the book on these projects. These are outstanding costs to the state. What is your plan to deal with these projects?